ambulances, a lot of ambulances. She's within 10 minutes of one of the hard hit parts of Queens. And yeah, but there's at least, I mean, New York is bad, but you know, it's not one of the, it's a stubborn place, which is a good thing. And at least it's not, you know, other areas of the United States, which are going to get worse as we go along.
Michigan?
Oh, frig, that is scary.
I saw someone post last night about what happened to Tamir Rice, if you're familiar with that.
Yep.
And then just the lack of any official repression of dozens of armed people walking into the Michigan legislature. It is, wow.
Yep. It's a country of very stark contradictions, and they don't, yeah.
So a fellow historian?
She's a librarian by trade. She currently works in mental health home care. She's their admin. And she's actually applied for some of the contact tracing jobs that are getting started thanks to the mayor. So hopefully she'll get that, because that'll be a really interesting thing.
Okay, cool. Well, if anybody can see this, this is Joel Harden, and
I'm Santa Garin.
and we are here because today is May Day. So if you're tuning into this, I understand we may be live already. Get yourself a nice afternoon beverage of your choosing. This is May Day.
Happy May Day.
Happy May Day to you, Santa. Nice to see you. And why don't you tell folks where you are at the moment in this wonderful planet we live on?
Well, while I am a resident of Ottawa, I'm not currently in Ottawa. I'm in my dad's hometown of Noëlville, Ontario, about 45 minutes outside of Sudbury. I needed some respite for my mental health, being stuck in a one-room apartment in downtown Ottawa. And so I am up in the near north for the duration.
Well, and please give your family our very best.
I shall.
I am in the basement here of our home in Ottawa, Algonquin territory here. And thank you very much to everybody who's tuning into this. This is another opportunity our office is trying to extend to people who follow us so we can stay in touch, so we can stay together. Today is May Day. So we're not going to get started just yet. We're going to let people join, and they'll continue to do so in the next number of minutes. But once we get started, Sam and I are going to have a discussion about May Day. Because it's not as well known a labor holiday as another Labor Day, and that may be some of what we discuss. And also, one of the great things about having Sana on with us as well is that we can delve into Ottawa-specific labor history. So for those who are following us here in Ottawa or who have an interest in labor history, Sana was part of a collective of people that did fantastic work at the Ottawa Workers Museum.
Yeah, the Workers' History Museum.
Workers' History Museum, excuse me. So there is just so much to do, and always remembering the legacy of all of the work, all of the laboring that's gone into the places where we live and where we enjoy, where we fraternize, where we understand each other. So for those of you who are enjoying this online learning experience, that's what we're talking about. It's May Day. Happy May Day. So I'm going to take a few moments and I'm going to play a musical interlude here. The musical interlude is an old wobbly song. By wobbly, I mean from the industrial workers of the world. So if you can cast your mind back 100 years, even further, think about major cities and towns and how people used to organize in an age before the internet. You know, for any millennials tuning into this or those younger, it did exist, in fact. And how did people organize? How did they draw attention? One of my favorite wobbly stories is this. It comes from this song. So what would happen, believe it or not, is they would stage a mugging in a major urban center. So they would dress somebody up in, very prim and proper suit with a proper bowler hat, not a working person's hat like Son and I are wearing right now, and a three-piece suit, and they would tackle them in the middle of a town square and stage a mugging, and it would draw a huge commotion, and people would gather around. And the person, as they were being tackled, would be yelling out, help me, I'm being mugged, I'm being robbed. And, you know, as enough people gathered, you know, this person would jump to their feet amidst all the other people, said, I've been robbed by the capitalist system, right? And they would, the soapbox would come out and they would erupt into song. And this is one of the songs they would sing. It's called The Preacher and the Slave, and it goes like this. Long-haired preachers come out every night, try to tell you what's wrong and what's right. But when asked about something to eat, they will answer in voices so sweet. You will eat by and by in the glorious land in the sky. Work and pray, live on hay, and you'll eat in the sweet by and by. Holy rollers and jumpers come out, and they scream and they holler and they shout. Give your money to Jesus, they say. He will cure all diseases today. And you will eat by and by in the glorious land in the sky. Work and pray, live on hay, and you'll eat in the sweet by and by. Here comes the wobbly verse. Working people of all countries unite. Side by side for our freedom we'll fight. When the world and its wealth we have gained, to the grafters we'll sing this refrain. You will eat by and by when you've learned how to cook, how to fry. Chop some wood, it'll do you good, and you'll eat in the sweet by and by, and that's no lie. All right, here we go.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Sana. Thank you. And thanks to all of you who are tuning into this. Happy May Day. Happy May Day. And well, thank you, Matt, for your comment. We'll have to understand the bait and switch there. I will always love the industrial workers of the world. And Sana, let's get started. Let's think about May Day. So, as I see it, as someone who's benefited from some reading of labor history, someone who's been a union activist for many years, it really seems as if this holiday, May 1st, celebrated by at least 66 countries around the world, many more, including ours unofficially, is lesser known in Canada. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the origins of May Day as someone, you know, very much steeped in labor history. And you know, how it would compare to Labor Day, which many more Canadians are very much more familiar with, you know, early in September, picnics, parades. Help us understand May Day from your perspective.
Okay, well, so both of the holidays come from the 19th century, which was a big period of unionization, the struggle for rights for workers, and so May Day, it comes out of the 8-hour movement. And what we mean by 8-hour movement is that back then, once upon a time, workers were working on average 60 hours a week. And how were they doing that? They were doing 6 days of 10 hours. So Monday to Saturday, 10 hours, Sunday, of course, because we were a Christian country, that was, you know, your day off. And that was a lot. You know, you might get your half-hour break. That was about it. So workers wanted more rest. Mm-hmm. And so this really comes to a header in 1886. And in that year, there was a lot of strikes all over, especially in the United States. And we're really focused on the United States, ironically, in this. And we'll see ironically why. So there were demonstrations and strikes all across the United States in 1886 on May 1st. And on May 3rd in Chicago, there was a particular workplace that had been out on strike since I think February of that year. And the Chicago police came in, they broke up the strike, and it was extremely violent, killed several of the workers. On May 4th, obviously workers in Chicago being extremely concerned about what had just happened, they have a rally in Haymarket Square on the evening of May 4th. And of course, the popular establishment doesn't want this to happen, and the workers were being seen as particularly anarchistic. So the Chicago police came, and as they started to break up the rally, there was a bomb that exploded in their path.
Wow.
Homemade bomb. The police in the confusion opened fire. Some of the protesters and some of the strikers, given that it's the States, they shot back. In all, at least 4 workers were killed. They're not really sure how many. 7 police officers were killed, many, many more wounded. And it's in memory of this particular set of circumstances that May Day is particularly it's what it's commemorating. Mm-hmm. And so you can see how it's got a little bit of it's a little bit of an anarchist flavor, if you will. Yeah. But this is also the Victorian period, and the Victorian period is really about respectability and trying to be more palatable to popular society, and so so at the same time as this early May Day is happening, there's also a more genteel version, if you will, that the more respectable workers' movements are doing. It's happening in the United States, and it's also happening in Canada. And it's the Knights of Labor, especially. They were a labor movement, but they were also sort of like a secret society, because those were really popular fraternal kind of organizations that existed in the late 19th century. And they came to Canada. Hang on, look at my notes. I feel like I'm doing a final here. So the Knights of Labor, they were really popular in the 1880s. They started out in Montreal. They also came to, Montreal, Hamilton. They came to Ottawa as well. They were really popular in the industries around the Breton Flats. And what's kind of neat about the Knights of Labor is that, yes, they were a labor organizer. They were also a reform kind of movement. They wanted workplaces to be more hygienic. They wanted equal pay for men and women, which was understandably really radical for those days. Mm-hmm. And they also provided benefits for members and their families, mm-hmm. including, burial insurance and things like that. So, union and more. And they sort of went the respectable route. They were really pressuring the established governments to have a working day, a holiday for workers. Because if you think of it, you only have one day off, and not a lot to rest and not a lot of time to enjoy what was going on. So 1894 is a big year for Labor Day, because after a debate in the federal government, Johnny MacDonald's government passed Labor Day as a day to honor workers. So it's the first 2-day weekend that workers would have had back then. Mm-hmm. Wow. And the American government would have passed it at that same year. And so May Day, as we know it, never really caught on in Canada. And even in the States, as you know, it really began, especially after 1917, and the Bolsheviks, it really began to be sort of pushed to the side and not seen as the, proper way to respect, to honor workers. And
Sana, is it fair to say too that the legacy of May Day was very much something born from industrial workers, people in the United States who, if we were to analogize it to today, folks who are working in industries where the conditions are extremely harsh, logging, mining, service sector jobs that are not as prestigious, or is that an unfair characterization?
I would say that that's kind of unfair because the labor movement is industrial workers as well. They just took a different route. One was using the established parameters that existed. It's a movement that's called laborism, where they were using, politics. There would be city councilors who were of the Labor Party, just like, we now have provincial and federal equivalents.
Yeah.
So they were working the system to get what they want versus, the more anarchistic trend that people perceived May Day to represent, if that makes sense.
So, I mean, the question then for us to consider is, why wasn't this taken up in Canada? And why did the US government, I guess first it was under Grover Cleveland, right, in 1894, and labor and later in Canada, why was there this particularly persistent effort, at least as I've understood it with articles you shared with me and then I've read on my own, to have a different tradition? Was there a fear from people who were in charge at the time that a lot of the forces who were behind the Haymarket riots, for example, the alleged violence that took place, the people who were sentenced to death as a consequence of that incident, prominent anarchist organizers in Chicago, for example. Others were pardoned subsequent to those trials.
Yep.
Do you believe it's fair to say that there was a concerted attempt to suggest a more respectable path for labor in advocating, as opposed to what was seen as the more rebellious, the less constructive? And how did that happen? How was that choice presented to workers back then?
That's a good question. Well, Labor Day, so the September holiday, that became associated with parades, especially. And the Labor Day parade, so I mean, there is a May Day parade, but so the thing about parades, especially in the Victorian context, is that it was a way for a group to legitimize themselves by first showing out, hey, we're here, we exist, and also by extending their route outside of the neighborhoods associated with them. So like, think of Pride parades, St. Patrick's Day parades. This was the respectable way to say, hey, we're here, we exist. And I think by also appealing to the more I hate the word respectable, but it is all about respectability. I think it's by making it just the more palatable option for workers. Okay. And one of the difficulties with the labor movement at the time, and to an extent that still exists, I'm saying this as a union member, but there is an emphasis on the skilled laborers versus the unskilled, and right. I don't like that term because of course everything is a skill. Yeah. So it was all about respectability.
So I find that fascinating, and I want to just explore that with you for a second as a bit of a May Day consideration to mull over. So back at the time in 1886, when the Haymarket riots happened, and the year after, where socialist parties all over the world said, given what's happened in the United States, we think there should be a day, there should be a mobilization, a global mobilization, to acknowledge the Haymarket martyrs, as they were called back then, and the need for more rights and less exploitation of workers, given the harsh nature of work, child labor, conditions of work. And there was this tension between people in guilds, in purported to be skilled professions, artisans, right? Yep. And roughnecks working in logging camps, and miners, and others deemed to be certainly workers, but less reputable trade, less prestigious occupations, right? There was this divide, and it would seem to me from what you're saying, there was a path suggested to working people back then that there was a respectable way to
Mhm.
advocate for the interests of working folks, and it was to hold parades, it was to hold picnics, it was to run for
Yep.
office,
Yep.
to be
Take link with the
respectful,
community. Yep. Yep.
you know, and the whole mass mobilization, organizing, particularly in trades, and there's a racial dimension to this too, right?
Mhm.
A lot of the folks populated into those less skilled professions. I mean,
Mhm.
those are quotes given what you said. Um, we're recent immigrants in many cases, right? Certainly in Canada. So I guess I'm wondering the extent to which this debate has left us, right? So we're living right now, we're living in the coronavirus,
Yeah,
okay?
yes, you are. Yep.
And a lot of the professions that are being thanked daily by political leaders all over the world
Mhm.
are in fact the least prestigious professions, some of the worst paid occupations. I'm thinking about grocery store clerks. I'm thinking about personal support workers who work
Mhm.
with the disabled, to work with the elderly. I mean, my goodness, our office has had occasion to talk to so many personal support workers, many of whom are not unionized, who are only paid for the 15 minutes where they interact with someone in an apartment, and then they take the bus all over town.
Yep.
They're stitching 2 or 3 jobs together, you know, many of whom even today are still functioning without personal protective equipment to keep them safe, to keep the people they work with safe. I'm thinking also about our agricultural system, you know, and our food procurement system, which has been thrown into crisis. So we're hearing increasingly that there will be a global food shortage by this month, in the next couple of weeks, because the global logistics system for food, the slaughterhouses, the huge granaries, the various supermarkets that draw the end products from that, the food processing places, the big engines of our food system in the world are jammed up because of the coronavirus. And a lot of the workers feeding that system, I'm thinking about migrant workers who come to Canada from other countries, who absolutely aren't unionized, who, you know, study after study has shown are not working in many cases in fair and just conditions. I guess I'm wondering about the extent to which in your opinion, as a May Day reflection, like how much is this debate about, you know, respectable labor, prestigious occupations, non-prestigious occupations, respectable ways of fighting for justice at work versus, you know, less respectful attack? How much is this still with us? What do you think?
I think we still have it to some extent. I mean, I work for the federal public service, and I'm very happy to have a laptop where I can work from home, although I don't have my ergonomic equipment. And so I am very grateful to be where I am. When I used to work in the museum field, I definitely was precarious employment. I would be getting my unemployment right now. I think that there's always going to be a need for more mobilization and more action needed to support those who are being left behind. That's definitely something that I think we are using May Day more to remember.
Right, right.
And one thing I forgot to mention about May Day is that it's more of a cultural thing here. It's more of a cultural thing, like it's a time for cultural events, because it wasn't until the late 70s and 80s that the Public Service Alliance in Canada and the NDP caucus, actually, local council, they started to bring it in, and it did get resistance from the labor movement, from the mainstream. But there's Mayworks festivals that happen in many major Canadian cities, including Ottawa, and I guess it's not happening this year, unfortunately. But I think this is definitely our period to reflect on, what we've accomplished as on the larger scale of the labor movement, and also where we need to grow next. I mean, a lot of unions didn't have women involved, and even if they did, it was extremely limited, because 100 years ago, the point of the union was to make sure that a man had a wage that could support a family. And, you know, why would a woman need to work? Because, you know, she's just gonna get married, right? So I think with respectability politics and laborism, I think that, you know, it's good to use a system, and it's also good to think about where the system is lacking and where we need to go next.
Yeah. So you're making me think of Foodora workers who've just organized, right? And just organized against an enormous multinational that fought every step of the way for where they are now and will continue to fight every step of the way. And
Yeah.
when I think about the IWW, the International Workers of the World, who were the dominant union at the time of the original May Day, certainly in the United States, they had a presence here as well as the One Big Union movement. Their approach to organization was very different than what we see in normal labor relations, right? So in normal labor relations, it's not easy to organize under traditional labor relations. There are fleets of corporate lawyers out there. There are fleets of union busting tactics that some employers will use to frustrate unionization drives. There's a long process by which, even if you're able to convince a majority of your colleagues to consider a unionization vote, where employers can influence the outcome of a union election. And what I remember from, as a May Day reflection from the One Big Union in the IWW tradition, is they explicitly were operating outside of that framework. They were saying, more important for us to, through a tactic of direct action or holding immediate workplace actions without consent from government officials, simply using the will of the workers at a given facility to impose decisions upon employers if employers are being unfair, if workers were being killed in a mine, for example. You're in Northern Ontario right now. Sudbury is rich with these lessons, right?
Yes.
You know, we don't want to wait for government inspectors, government relations officials, various lawyers to intervene. This is intended to drag out the process, to demoralize the unionization drive. When I think about the Foodora workers, it's interesting. The more I've learned about how they've organized, it's kind of analogous in that they have utilized these new information technologies, the art of the computer in our pockets to network themselves and almost suggest to Foodora as a multinational. And this has happened, as I understand it, to Uber in other places where drivers have organized in a similar way, almost outside the normal labor relations system, Sana. So is that hearkening back to the May Day labor tradition? What do you think?
I think there's definitely something there. The other thing that comes to mind too is the fact that we're in this current crisis, we're seeing there's a lot of exploitation, but there's a lot of wonderful silver, golden moments of workers standing up for their rights and actually getting them, and workers being recognized for the sacrifice that they're doing.
Yes.
So for example, there is the Amazon strike today.
Yes.
Yep, for Whole Foods, Amazon Prime. So as much as I love my Amazon Prime, I'm not watching it today. The little things you can do, right? But I definitely think that there's always a need for the grassroots to refresh a movement, to remind a movement that just because it's status quo doesn't mean that it should remain a status quo, regardless of what the organization is, whether it's political, whether it's a union, whether it's an organization. There's always room for progress.
Yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. And what I'm thinking too, as a further May Day reflection is, I spent a long time in previous life working for unions, and I have an enormous amount of respect for members, people who give themselves over, like literally give their lives over to advancing a union in the more respectable context. We need all of that. But I remember someone who will remain nameless for our conversation, but telling me on their way out on their retirement party, leaning over to me and saying, Joel, here's the problem with our movement. we are too busy fighting for workers who are already unionized. Whether it was, trying to encourage unionized workers at a particular union to decertify that union and go over to another union. We are chasing the high status occupations that bring with them a lot of union dues that allow unions to continue to function. And once upon a time, this person confided in me, because we share a similar reading of labor history, the goal of the labor movement wasn't to fight over workers with good jobs. The goal of the labor movement was to turn lousy jobs into good jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And this person was impressing upon me. And I think particularly for those of you who are out there watching, if you're interested in this particular take on labor history as a May Day reflection, you should read the work of Jane McAlevey, who is one of the best labor organizers, in my opinion, we know of, I've ever seen. And Jane very much has the perspective that workers and their unions and people who are even outside of the traditional labor relations structure, we have to make some strategic decisions, as people did in the 1880s. They didn't just run around and try to organize everything. They were very strategic. They wanted the trucking industry. They wanted the mining industry. Mm-hmm. They wanted forestry. They wanted those nodes of the economy where they could have particular influence over owners and how they were structuring the economy and to whose benefit. So Jane, and if you go and you follow Jane's lectures, what she is encouraging unions and members to consider is the strategically useful position of healthcare workers in the healthcare industry. And in Canada, we may like to think that this is a completely public sector, and it's not. Like 30% of our healthcare industry that we fund through public dollars is held in private hands. And here in COVID, we know our medical labs, which have taken forever to generate those tests, those are privately held labs, whether they're Dynacare or another organization. We know personal support workers, long-term care homes. Many of these are held in private hands. And I know many unions, I think following some of James' logic, is trying to figure out a way to get into these crucial sectors that we can see right now clearly are very important. Like we rely on them maybe in a way that many of us didn't realize. So I send it to you as a May Day reflection here. How important do you think strategy is for, union organizing or even labor organizing going forward? How important was it back at the time of May Day? And, what are some of the lessons for union leadership, union organizers, or people who just want to stand up for what's right in their workplace, given all of that?
So the funny thing about the labor movement, they're really bad at remembering their own history. That's, I remember when I was researching a paper and I was trying to go through minute books of Ottawa labor, the locals of the labor movement in Ottawa for the First World War, and there aren't many. And if they do exist, it's not much has changed. It's almost like they keep on reinventing the wheel. And I say this as, again, having been a member of many different unions in my time. I think there is, and of course, there's always that wonderful saying of, if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot to take from looking at where we've gone, how have we gotten to where we are now? What have we lost? What have we forgotten? Yeah. It's finding good to keep on supporting the workers who have been unionized, because there's always pushback. I mean, working for the federal government, it happens. But we should always be thinking about the collective, and I think that's what, to be honest, I think that's going to be the lesson of COVID-19, is that we can't. The weaknesses in our system are, and this might be simplifying it, but for me, it's forgetting we're a collective, we're a community, right? And where we are the weakest and where people have the weakest rights, that's going to be the weak points in the system. And even though we don't have a May Day situation, you know, a festival going on for Mayworks, and we can't, you know, go out in support of our workers, we can still work in other ways. And because even though the 1880s and 90s, you know, and we were seeing real advances in unionization and, you know, reaching out to some of the unskilled trades, if you will, but that kept on going, you know. Yeah, I think I got off on a tangent, but yeah, we have to remember we're a collective. We are a collective, and I know that sometimes has a pejorative term, but I don't really care in this context. But and I think that's part of why we're seeing so much problems south of the border, is because they have forgotten that society is a collective, you know, the social contract of you know, being, yeah.
Yeah, we were talking about the events at
Yeah.
Mission yesterday as we were getting started here. Yeah, absolutely. I hear you.
Yep. Yep. Because one thing in our, when we were talking about you know, the labor history, especially in Ottawa. So in the First World War, we didn't have Labor Day parades.
Mm-hmm.
So the local umbrella organization at the time was called the Allied Trades and Labor Association, or ATLA. And their subcommittee that was looking at Labor Day in 1914, with the start of the war, they were noticing that they weren't getting as much support from the communities as normally would for the parade. So in 1915, it was canceled, and I think they didn't have it again until maybe after the influenza pandemics. Mm-hmm. But that didn't mean, and just because they couldn't be out there in the public eye, you know, hey, we're here kind of parade, doesn't mean that they stopped. When I was going through the minute books for ATLA, you know, every year there was more and more people, more unions that were getting started, new areas of society that were being unionized. The First World War was the first time that public servants were being organized, actually, mm-hmm. Which was a cool milestone. Yeah, it's, we have to keep on, we need to get back to making sure that, you know, whether, because, you know, there's so much precarious employment now, you know, let's have an 8-hour movement again, but, you know, to get an 8-hour versus, you know, fragments of, you know, 3 hours here, 4 hours there.
No, I think you're onto something. I think you're onto something. And I also think when I'm listening to you, I'm remembering, you know, the generation of my grandparents, you know, that generation that built the welfare state after the Second World War, and their expectation, which is informed by this period we're talking about, that the weekend was the weekend. You know, the Sunday shopping debate happened probably, I think we're roughly around the same age. I'm in my 40s.
Yep.
Okay, so that happened when I was a kid, and I remember my grandparents being very disturbed by this conversation, right? Like that this is supposed to be sacrosanct. And you know, when I was looking at over some of the research notes that we get from our very talented research team at the legislature for the NDP, you know, it's startling to be reminded that a third of the jobs in our economy can be defined as precarious, low-wage jobs. A third, and 50% of people today live from paycheck to paycheck. 50%, and people are leveraged to the hilt. 171% debt to income right now. I mean, it is precarious for a lot of families out there, and a lot of people are absolutely stressed to the limit. And you know, we somebody once described it to me as this period we're living kind of like being like the 1930s in slow motion. You know, like if the Great Depression happened, like we just dropped on the world, we are lurching our way back there, disguised maybe by the availability of credit. I don't know what you think.
I almost think of it as I mean, because I mean, the post-war up until the 1980s were a little bit of a good blip, because normally, you know, there would be about, you know, 10, 15, you know, about 15 years between, you know, bust and booms back in the day. But I think that we're we're in like the Great Depression mixed with, you know, the latest industrial revolution. You know, digitization has been great, but it has still meant that, you know, just like when, you know, as you know, factories became more industrialized, and that meant that that less workers were needed. You know, we're in that same kind of movement, but just, you know, digital. And
Yeah.
at the same time, you know, yes, you know, 7.5 hours, 8 hours, whatever, but I had a period in time when I was hooked up to a BlackBerry for my job, and no longer, thankfully. But yeah, there's weird. At the same time, people aren't working enough, and then sometimes people are working too much.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the re-intensification of work, you know, and this is a leash. It's not a
Yes.
tool. You know, I was reading. We're drawing this conversation to a close before long, but I was reading a sociologist talking about our generation of workers being one of the loneliest ever. That you know, we don't have people for dinner anymore. We we
Mhm.
we think about likes and shares
Yep.
as social contact after work, when in fact more often than not, if that thing's buzzing in my pocket, it's an urgency about work that we have to pay attention to, right?
Yep.
So
Versus our grandparents, when they had a lot of workplaces would have, you know, baseball teams and bowling leagues and
there you
things like
go.
that. Like, it was definitely
Right.
work was work, but it was also a huge segment of, well, it also goes to, you know, you would also work in one place for your entire career.
Yes.
But maybe that's something else we can talk about, because this is fun. I get to see a face. Um, but the one thing I do want and I'm sure we're about to wrap up our at least our conversation bit, but the one thing I just want to, being a historian and, you know, seeing trends and, you know,
Yeah.
influences of the past.
Yeah.
So First World War, Second World War, we see great changes in, you know, women coming into the workforce, men going overseas, you know, wages going up, and you know, a lot, you know, more better circumstances. But then when it's done, you know, the establishment wanting to get back to the status quo and
Yeah.
forcibly resetting everything.
Yeah.
Um, I go on Twitter and I see the wonderful things that are happening, and I'm like, yes, but how long? We have to remember that this could be you know, these gains. Progress is a wonderful thing to have, but there's also the other side of the coin,
Mhm.
regress, to reestablish the status quo. That's something that I think we have to be mindful of.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I would agree. I have this expression that I love that comes from elders in the NDP. Many like Broadbent, Leighton, Evelyn Gigantes, who still lives here in Ottawa Centre, who was our Minister of Health and Housing in the 90s. Don Heap, whose son David I love. They call it the prophetic vision, maintaining the flame of the prophetic vision, the other society. And that's, I
Mhm.
guess maybe that's my other May Day reflection. You get the last word, Sana, but my segueing to you, I think about the need for us to hold up that prophetic vision, whatever we want to call that. Like, you could
Mhm.
call that fairness, you could call it anarchism, you could call it socialism, you could call it whatever you want to call it. I personally don't care. But if we aren't guided by that bigger vision of the kind of society we want, it would seem to me we're always going to be chasing the tail of whatever project gets designed for us, right? I mean, at the moment, it would seem to me we have a society for the Weston family that runs Loblaws and Shoppers Drug Mart, who are making a killing right now, and receive any number of subsidies from our public dollars, while they pay very little in taxes to actually pay for anything that is actually required, like healthcare and education. And that we live in their world, and their lobbyists and their lawyers will ensure that world persists. But as we wrote, as our MPP office wrote on Earth Day, which was last week,
Mhm.
we don't want to go back to normal. I love the fact, personally, speaking only personally, that I've had time to spend with our kids here on the weekend instead of being shuttling around to events. I love the fact that people have had, maybe those of us with the privilege to stay home, who aren't out there on the front lines, have had the privilege to think a little bit And maybe, however you want to define yourself, maybe on May Day, we can honor our ancestors by saying, those of you who made huge sacrifices. Maybe I could say that with the Bernie Sanders accent. Huge, huge sacrifices for our well-being. First of all, thank you. And second of all, let's not chase our tails anymore. Let's demand a lot more from our political system. What do you think?
We need a new normal, and the new normal needs to be more fair. It needs to be equal. It needs to, we need to shore up the weak. We need to help. We need to have a livable society for everyone.
Oh yeah.
Doesn't matter who they are.
Oh yeah. Matt Lipton's asking on the chat.
Oh, there's lots of good questions from Matt.
So there you go. Like, have there ever been any general strikes in Ottawa?
Yes. There was sort of. Going back to I always jokingly say the First World War is my favorite war, not because I love war, but because it's just so darn interesting. So in 1917, at least in Canada, workplaces were beginning to strike because of the expectation to work and and for the war effort, and also sort of coincided with beginning to censor. There used to be a labor column in the Ottawa paper, actually, and around the same time it got co-opted. And then once the First World War ended and they were trying to sort of reset industry and society back to what it was, and workers weren't pleased about it, along with other things. So there were actually quite a few general strikes across Canada in 1919, the most famous of which was actually, Winnipeg. In Ottawa, the flashpoint, I believe, if I remember correctly, was July. And so, the telephone operators were on strike. Transit was on strike. It wasn't owned by the city at the time. It was a private corporation. The epicenter of the action was where the War Memorial is right now. And there were scabs driving the streetcars, and one of them lost control of one of the trams, and it was veering out of control. And one of the striking streetcar operators recognized what was going on, and there was a kid in the way, and he's trying to run onto the streetcar because the scab didn't know how to operate the car properly, and and the police officers were trying to stop them, and they did manage to stop the streetcar in time. It's not like the tramway paradigm from philosophy, but so we did have a general strike in 1919. It wasn't as explosive as Winnipeg's, but the Ottawa labor movement, I think, because we've been in proximity to Parliament, has been slightly less reactive than perhaps other parts of Canada. Because we're such a strange city, because we've got the city and the capital overlaying itself, and it's never had a really easy relationship. So yeah, and then Matt's also asking about the Knights of Labor. So yeah, so in the in the 19th century there was the Orange Lodge, there was the Odd Fellows, there was there were a lot of organizations. So kind of like the Freemasons, they had you had to be initiated. There were there was paraphernalia to be worn. They were really in the labor. They were in the lumber industry and elsewhere, and also they were kind of like a secret society, and definitely a really good way too for people to meet and talk and exchange ideas and have opportunities to organize and learn about opportunities. Maybe that's something that we need more. We need more opportunities for people to come out and talk and exchange ideas. And you may not agree with everything that's being said, but there's always a good point somewhere. Not maybe all the time, but
Okay.
I'm the type of person who always loves learning new things, and even if I don't agree with it, I still like hearing what other people have to say.
Well, one of the many things we love about you, Summer. One of the many things. But
Thanks.
thank you very much for being with us today. And
My
thank you
pleasure.
to all of you who've tuned in. Happy May Day.
Happy May Day.
And let's do this again. Let's have another labor history discussion, Sana. Let's figure out another time, whether it's about the canal or the Corktown Bridge or something else significant, the collapse of the Heron Bridge. We should do this again. We should have a discussion again about labor in our city. And thank you to all of you out there working for justice. Keep going. Don't give up. The May Day martyrs wouldn't have wanted you to. Okay. Thanks.
Solidarity.
Sana.